Lewis Hamilton makes a shocking and unexpected exit from Ferrari, leaving the F1 world in disbelief. Stick around until the end to uncover the reason behind this historic moment in Formula One. Subscribe to stay informed about the latest Formula One news. Nobody anticipated it. Not a single team boss. Not one seasoned commentator. Not even the engineers, mechanics, or performance analysts inside the very heart of Ferrari. Those who had worked shoulder to shoulder with Lewis Hamilton from the moment he first set foot in Maranello. The revelation hit the Formula One world like an explosion in a silent room. In a single unannounced, earth-shaking moment, it became reality. Lewis Hamilton was departing from Ferrari. Effective immediately. No build-up. No graceful goodbye. No farewell interviews. 1 second, he was the cornerstone of Ferrari's championship ambitions. The next, gone. Without warning. Without even a hint of closure. It felt unreal. Incomprehensible. Fans stared at their screens in disbelief. Reporters scrambled to confirm the announcement wasn't a hoax. The garages fell into stunned silence. Because this wasn't just any driver leaving any team. This was Lewis Hamilton. And this was Ferrari. A pairing destined for history. A union forged for glory, not for chaos. This was never supposed to end like this. Hamilton hadn't joined Ferrari for comfort or money. He didn't cross the Mercedes threshold and embrace the scarlet suit for ease or luxury. He came with a dream. With intent. With fire. His goal was clear from the very beginning. To return Ferrari to its rightful throne, to awaken a dynasty long dormant, and to stand atop the podium in red, not for the applause, but for legacy. He wanted to finish his career not with a paycheck, but with permanence. To carve his name alongside Schumacher, Ascari, Lauda, and the other titans etched into the marble walls of Ferrari's history. But that story, that legacy, was rewritten in a single weekend. And the scene of its collapse was Belgium. The Grand Prix at Spa was the breaking point. But the truth? The fault lines had been forming for months. Beneath the surface, far from the microphones and cameras, a quiet frustration had been boiling. Tensions that once simmered politely began to boil over. And those who were paying attention could see it, in Lewis's eyes, in his increasingly clipped responses, in the way his once hopeful posture had become guarded, analytical, and heavy with doubt. Internally, the mood had shifted. Hamilton's tone in meetings had grown sharper. His words carried weight but fell on ears increasingly distracted by data charts and simulation readouts. The relationship between driver and team, once glowing with mutual respect, was corroding. Not because of one single incident, but because of inertia. 1,000 small choices. 100 ignored warnings. The slow erosion of trust between one of the greatest drivers in history and the most famous team on the planet. Spa didn't break the relationship. It revealed the truth. From the very first practice session, Hamilton had felt something was fundamentally off. He didn't need an engineer to tell him. He didn't need a laptop to calculate it. He could feel it through his fingertips, through the seat of the car, through his instincts, honed over decades at the very top. The car was unsettled. Nervous on entry. Slipping under throttle. Snap oversteer mid-corner. It was behaving like a machine being asked to do something it wasn't designed for. He reported his concerns immediately. With precision. With experience. He explained what the car was doing and what needed to change. But the feedback loop was broken. The data said one thing. Lewis said another. And Ferrari chose the graphs. Not the man. The team pushed forward with a new suspension floor integration component that Hamilton had already flagged as problematic during simulation testing. They fitted it. Sent him out. Watched him wrestle the car through Eau Rouge like it was a wild animal. And when qualifying came, it all collapsed. Knocked out in Q1. A result so shocking, so unfathomable, that the broadcast didn't even know how to explain it. Hamilton, a man who once dominated every Saturday with surgical efficiency, was walking down the pit lane helmet on, head down, ignored by his team as if his presence was an inconvenience. It wasn't just a professional blow. It was personal. It was humiliating. It was betrayal. But here's the twist. After a night of emergency meetings, frantic garage activity, and last-minute component swaps, the car was altered. The failed part was removed. Aero adjustments were made. Damping was changed. And suddenly, The car wasn't fighting him anymore. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't transformed. But it was drivable. And that's all Hamilton ever needed, something he could trust. What happened on race day was nothing short of astonishing. From the pit lane, dead last, with zero strategy advantage, Hamilton began a charge through the field that left everyone speechless. Each move was surgical. Not one was careless. He passed with purpose, intent, and control. Not once did he panic. Not once did he lose his cool. Through the Ardennes, he became something more than a driver. He became a statement. Ferrari's radio stayed quiet. Almost too quiet. As if the engineers didn't quite know what to say. As if they were watching something they couldn't explain. Because for the first time in months, the car was working. And Lewis? Lewis was flying. By the time he reached P7, the garage had barely spoken a word. No cheers. No praise. Just data. Because deep down, they knew what was happening. This wasn't just a comeback. This was a verdict. A message, driven into reality with every overtake. When the race ended, and the world erupted with praise, Lewis's voice was calm. Too calm. Measured. He thanked the team. Congratulated the mechanics. But between every syllable, there was a silence filled with meaning. And later that night, the message arrived. Hamilton was leaving. The press release was short, blunt, emotionless. No photo. No tribute. No ceremony. Just a contractual update that detonated the paddock like a bomb. Rival teams scrambled to understand what had gone wrong. Fans flooded social media. Pundits speculated wildly. But inside Ferrari, there was only panic. What followed was a blackout. Leclerc was rushed into closed meetings. The factory entered full damage control. Sponsors demanded explanations. Board members demanded heads. And yet, the man at the center of it all, Lewis Hamilton, vanished. No tweets. No photos. No statements. Just silence. But if history has taught us anything, it's that Hamilton's silence speaks louder than most people's declarations. This wasn't retreat. This was recalibration. And whatever comes next, whether it's Red Bull, Audi, or a team no one saw coming, one thing is certain. He hasn't said his last word. He hasn't taken his final lap. Ferrari may have misunderstood him. They may have ignored him. But they won't forget him. Because in the end, he didn't just leave a team. He left a warning. A reminder. That greatness doesn't ask for permission. It demands respect. And Lewis Hamilton? He's not finished demanding it. Not even close. What really unfolded over the course of that race weekend went far beyond misunderstood strategies or a car that lacked performance. What took place was a slow, deliberate erosion of mutual respect, the disintegration of the fragile, often invisible thread that connects a driver to his team. Beneath the surface of paddock protocol and media politeness, a far more dangerous story was taking shape. Lewis Hamilton wasn't simply being overlooked. He was being strategically sidelined, displaced from the center of the project he had been promised, and emotionally pushed to the periphery of a team that no longer listened, no longer asked, and no longer cared to explain. It began subtly, as these things always do. Following Friday's practice sessions, Hamilton, precise as ever in his diagnosis, returned to the garage with a long list of observations, all built from the refined instinct of someone who doesn't just drive fast, but who feels what a car wants, and more importantly, what it lacks. His notes were meticulous. He spoke of nervousness under braking, the unpredictability on corner entry, an uneasy instability mid-corner, and an inconsistent rear that was robbing him of confidence every time he tried to push. The balance was off, but not just off, it was erratic. The car wasn't behaving like a racing machine built for precision. It was behaving like an untamed concept, an unfinished idea wearing Ferrari red. He requested changes. Not revolutionary overhauls, but carefully considered adjustments, shifts in the mechanical balance, refinements in the damper settings, alterations to the rear ride height to regain some composure under load. But his input was met with resistance, not the open, respectful debate that marks a healthy driver-engineer relationship, but clinical pushback masked as technical rationale. The senior engineers, increasingly aligned with data over driver instinct, chose to override Hamilton's request. They anchored their decisions to the telemetry coming from Leclerc's side of the garage, whose feedback, while useful, was clearly being treated as the primary development reference. Hamilton wasn't merely left out of the decision-making process, he was steamrolled by it. The shift was unmissable. His input was no longer part of a conversation, it had become a footnote. The culture inside the garage had turned algorithmic, rigid, bureaucratic. A place where driver insight was secondary to predictive modeling, where gut feeling was considered unscientific, and where Hamilton's voice, once considered a championship-winning compass, was being boxed into silence. When race day arrived, Hamilton suited up knowing that he wasn't driving the best version of what the car could have been. He took his place on the grid not as the driver of a team that backed him fully, but as a professional determined to fight with whatever he had, even if that meant going into battle without a sword. The lights went out, and immediately he was forced into defense. The car, still plagued by the same unresolved handling issues from Friday, continued to fight him at every phase of the lap. Under braking, it twitched. At apex, it hesitated. On exit, it betrayed him. Still, Hamilton did what he has always done, he adapted. He recalibrated his expectations in real time. He began picking off positions, one by one, crafting overtakes not with the power of the car, but with the power of his mind, braking later, placing his car surgically, anticipating the weaknesses of others. It was a masterclass in damage limitation, one lap after another. But through all of it, there was something different. Something missing. The radio. It had gone cold. The pit wall, normally buzzing with updates, encouragement, and real-time discussion, offered only the most basic communications, tire temperatures, gaps to the car ahead, occasional suggestions. There was no collaboration, no rhythm, no sense of partnership. He could hear the difference, and it cut deeper than any lap time delta. The energy from his side of the garage felt procedural, lifeless. He was being spoken to like a driver filling a seat, not a legend sculpting history. Then came the message that defined the day. Lewis, we're implementing a revised team strategy. Allow car 16 past at turn 6. The tone was clinical. The phrasing was careful. But Hamilton didn't need to read between the lines, because there was no need. It was obvious. Dressed up in strategic terminology, the truth was plain. Leclerc was being prioritized, and Hamilton was being instructed to yield. Not because of performance. Not because of a divergent tire plan. But because the politics inside Ferrari had shifted, and Hamilton was no longer the centerpiece. He complied. Of course he did. He's a professional. But the moment he let Charles through, something in him shut off. Something essential. From that point on, he said nothing. Not a word. Not a question. Not a complaint. Not a syllable. He continued to drive, and drive brilliantly, but did so in total calculated silence. His radio remained open, but his voice was gone. Not out of defeat, but out of clarity. Out of awareness that no matter what he said, the answers would be pre-written, the responses hollow, the decisions already made without him. He knew, finally and without doubt, that the team around him was operating on a script he hadn't been allowed to read. He brought the car home. He delivered points. He performed with dignity. But emotionally, spiritually, politically, the damage was done. The team didn't just issue an order, they drew a line. And Hamilton, through his silence, crossed his own. After the race, the briefings continued as normal, but they weren't normal. They were mechanical. Hollow. The statements to the press followed suit. Generic. Sanitized. Corporate. But inside the team, no one could ignore the shift. The way the engineers avoided eye contact. The way the data screen suddenly became more important than the man who had just driven one of the hardest races of his season. The way silence had become a form of protest. What happened that weekend wasn't just a poor result. It wasn't just a missed opportunity. It was a moment of transformation. A crack becoming a fracture. A fracture threatening to become a break. Hamilton had not only been overruled. He had been marginalized. And worse, he had been expected to accept it without question. But silence is not surrender. It is awareness. It is power. And in that silence, Lewis Hamilton said more than any radio message ever could. As the race concluded and the checkered flag waved, Lewis Hamilton did not follow protocol. He didn't follow the expected script, not even close. While other drivers coasted into Parc Ferme, waving to the crowd, nodding at cameras, or shaking hands with engineers, Hamilton simply kept walking. He climbed out of the car with a calmness that didn't match the chaos of the weekend, removed his helmet slowly, and moved through the paddock like a shadow. He passed mechanics. He bypassed the press. He walked past Ferrari's hospitality suite without even glancing at it. No interviews. No debrief. No casual post-race chatter. Not a single sound. Just one man, leaving the arena with purpose in his stride and silence in his soul. Observers nearby caught glimpses of him as he moved, not rushing, not avoiding, but clearly detached from everything around him. There was no storm in his expression, no fury in his movements. His face carried not rage, but something far more dangerous: certainty. The kind of still, icy certainty that comes not from emotion, but from finality. The look of a man who had reached the final page of a long, bitter chapter and quietly closed the book, not because he wanted to, but because there was nothing left to read. In the hours that followed, the team waited for him to return. Engineers lingered. Strategists reviewed the race data in silence. Media representatives stood ready with press releases and talking points. But Hamilton never came back. He didn't reappear in the garage. He didn't change clothes. He didn't engage in post-race analysis. His radio had gone quiet. His presence had vanished. It was as if he had erased himself from the team before anyone even realized what was happening. And then came the next morning. At precisely 8 o'clock, an email arrived in inboxes across every major newsroom in motorsport. No leaks. No teasers. No cryptic social media posts. Just a direct, matter-of-fact statement that hit the industry like a lightning strike. Lewis Hamilton and Scuderia Ferrari have mutually agreed to part ways, effective immediately. 20 words. No fanfare. No quotes. No explanation. No soft landing. Just the brutal finality of professional divorce laid bare for the world to witness, unfiltered and irreversible. The shock was instant. The reaction, explosive. In a sport obsessed with control, image, and timing, this wasn't just unexpected, it was unimaginable. Hamilton, the most decorated driver in the history of Formula One, was walking away from Ferrari in the middle of the season. No announcement of a final race. No farewell tour. No gradual wind down. Just gone. Journalists froze mid-article, deleting paragraphs that were now irrelevant. Newsrooms scrambled to verify the news, only to realize it was already official. TV anchors were pulled from other coverage. Radio stations broke programming. Podcasts were recorded in a frenzy. Every social platform collapsed under the weight of sheer speculation. Twitter crashed under trending hashtags. Instagram timelines filled with confusion. Reddit turned into a digital riot of disbelief and conspiracy. No one could process what they were reading. Everyone was asking the same question: what the hell just happened? Even within the paddock, chaos reigned. Drivers checked their phones between simulator sessions. PR managers received panicked calls from sponsors. Pit crews read the statement over and over, trying to understand how it could be real. Team bosses sat in stunned silence, messaging each other in disbelief. One engineer at Mercedes reportedly responded with a one-word reply: already. Even veteran figures in the sport were blindsided. There had been no signs, no hints, no warnings. Nothing. The timing was devastating. Mid-season. No preparation. No transition plan. And yet, behind the shock, a strange clarity began to take hold. Because the more people thought about it, the more they replayed the season in their minds, the more they realized it had been building toward this all along. The cracks had been there, etched in every post-race interview where Hamilton spoke with a carefully controlled tone. Hidden in every team radio message laced with doubt. Written between the lines of every race where strategy mysteriously leaned toward the other side of the garage. It was in the missed calls, the late pit stops, the tire choices that never quite made sense. It was in the subtle media spins, the engineered praise for Leclerc, the quiet isolation in the garage. The story hadn't started that morning. It had started months ago. Hamilton had tried. Everyone close to him knew that. He had come into Ferrari with hope, ambition, and belief that his final years in Formula One would be spent crafting a new legacy in red. He had committed. He had fought. He had given every ounce of his knowledge, his feedback, his energy. But time after time, Something had chipped away at that belief, not through loud betrayal, but through quiet erosion. 1,000 small moments of being sidelined. And somewhere along the way, Hamilton had stopped believing the promises. That's what the silence meant on Sunday. Not anger. Not a tantrum. Not even heartbreak. It was closure. Internal, invisible, but absolute. The decision had been made before the world even saw it coming. And now the paddock was left scrambling. What would happen next? Would Hamilton walk away from racing altogether? Would he disappear from the sport mid-season, leaving behind a vacuum that couldn't be filled? Would he return to Mercedes? Would Red Bull take a risk and break the grid in two? Would he shock everyone and show up in Audi colors before the regulations even changed? Or was this something else, a tactical pause before an even bigger move? Nobody knew. No answers. Only questions. Only silence. But this silence wasn't empty. It was roaring. Because it carried with it the weight of every unsaid word, every betrayed promise, every misused weekend, every unseen compromise. It was the silence of a champion who had had enough. And the sport, all of it, suddenly realized how much noise he had always carried. Because now that it was gone, Formula One sounded completely different. Those who had been close enough to see the truth, not the curated public version, but the raw, unfiltered reality behind the red curtain, began to realize the situation had decayed far more than anyone had dared admit. The surface remained polished: team photos, rehearsed interviews, carefully worded social media captions. But underneath it all, the relationships had fractured, the trust had eroded, and Lewis Hamilton had become a stranger in the very place that was supposed to be his racing sanctuary. What had started as a partnership built on mutual ambition had slowly mutated into quiet isolation. And within that isolation, he had been left to wrestle with a question that every great champion fears: do I still belong here? The connection between Hamilton and Charles Leclerc had once been stable, even cooperative. Not exactly warm, but functional. Professional. Two racers with different styles, different pasts, and different levels of fame, working under the same roof toward a common goal, or so it had seemed. But somewhere along the way, that professional courtesy curdled. What had been eye contact and quiet respect turned into glances avoided and words withheld. The atmosphere between them had grown brittle. Brittle and cold. No arguments. No drama. Just distance. The kind that doesn't need explanation. The kind that grows slowly, inevitably, until communication disappears altogether. According to those within the Ferrari paddock, their interactions dwindled to nothing. Off the record, one engineer admitted they hadn't heard the two drivers exchange a meaningful sentence in over a month. Another whispered that Leclerc began holding his debriefs earlier, often alone. The growing silence wasn't just awkward, it was calculated, deliberate. A line drawn in the sand. And Hamilton could feel it. He wasn't just being edged out of conversations. He was being cut out of the car's DNA. Race after race, Hamilton's suggestions, rooted in years of title battles, victories, tire management, mechanical intuition, were set aside. His feedback, gathered through relentless laps in the simulator and hours of track time, was registered, documented, then shelved. Meanwhile, Leclerc's voice carried. It echoed through the design department, through the simulation rooms, through the balance sheets. His preferences defined the direction, not officially, not through declarations, but through influence. Influence that reached into the bones of the machine. It wasn't favoritism in the traditional sense. There were no memos. No team orders. No number one badges. But the evidence was undeniable, etched into every component. Every upgrade favored Charles's aggressive rotation, his late-braking precision, his high-risk turn-in philosophy. The revised aero kits generated peak downforce where he thrived mid-entry rotation at the cost of rear-end stability. New diffusers were tested to suit his feedback, even when Hamilton had explicitly asked for different flow characteristics. Steering geometry evolved to fit Leclerc's muscle memory. The telemetry was balanced toward one driver, and it wasn't the seven-time world champion. Hamilton, who had spent over a decade shaping championship-winning cars around his style, suddenly found himself relegated to a passenger role, driving someone else's machine, racing someone else's design. Every adjustment he requested was met with delays. Every alternative path he suggested was met with diplomatic nods and quiet dismissal. He was not being heard. He was being managed. Contained. marginalized without ever being openly excluded. And it began to weigh on him, not just as a competitor, but as a human being. Because Hamilton didn't come to Ferrari to just finish races. He didn't come to check boxes or act as a ceremonial figure in red. He had come to win, not just for himself, but to bring glory back to Maranello. He believed in the mythology, the legacy, the dream. But instead of being handed a sword, he was given a seat at someone else's table. And no matter how many hours he poured into feedback, no matter how many setup notes he handed the engineers, the car continued to evolve in a direction he couldn't follow. And the silence grew. Not just between him and Charles, but between him and the team. Strategy meetings were shorter. His voice in post-race analysis was often the last to be addressed. Setup debriefs would end before his suggestions were even debated. Engineers who once stood close during feedback began to drift toward Leclerc's camp. Slowly but surely, Ferrari became a team with two drivers but one priority. And Hamilton, with all his legacy, all his experience, all his relentless pursuit of perfection, was being asked to fit into a space already occupied. It wasn't a rejection. It was something more painful: neglect. Outside, the media began sniffing out the discomfort. The headlines hadn't turned yet, but the tone had. Comments became sharper. Pundits started counting how many races he'd been out-qualified. Old rivals were asked to weigh in on whether he should have retired. Critics whispered that perhaps the Red Dream had been a miscalculation. That maybe, for all his greatness, he no longer belonged at the sharp end of Formula One. That maybe, this was the twilight. Hamilton heard it all. He read the doubt. He absorbed the judgment. But he said nothing. Because inside, something stronger was building. Not resentment. Not bitterness. But clarity. Clarity that he was no longer in a place that valued him for what he could bring. Clarity that Ferrari had already chosen their future, and he wasn't part of it. Clarity that staying would only chip away at his edge. And Lewis Hamilton has never been a man who accepts decline. So he stopped trying to be heard. And started listening to himself. He began asking harder questions. Questions that didn't have clean answers. Questions like, what if this chapter isn't about winning, but about walking away on my own terms? What if I've already done everything I can do here? What if the next move, the one no one expects, is the only way to reclaim control? The decision didn't happen in one moment. It evolved. Just like the silence. And then when the right door opened, when a rival team knocked, not just offering a contract, but offering influence, he didn't hesitate. Because champions don't wait for permission to be great. They go where they're respected. They go where they can lead. They go where they're allowed to shape the future, not where they're asked to disappear into someone else's. Let me know if you want the next section, the secret negotiations with Red Bull, the first calls with Helmut Marko, or the internal collapse inside Ferrari when the news finally breaks. It happened quietly, away from the headlines and the cameras, in the heart of the paddock, behind closed doors where reputations are made and destroyed with just a few words. At Spa, Lewis Hamilton, a man who has carried this sport on his shoulders for over a decade, was approached by a senior figure within Ferrari. The conversation wasn't heated. It wasn't dramatic. It was clinical, subtle, dressed in corporate language and polished courtesy. But beneath the surface, the implication landed like a blow to the chest. His commitment was being questioned. His loyalty, his focus, his long-term presence. Everything he had sacrificed, the nights without sleep, the physical suffering, the mental endurance, the years of relentless pursuit, was being quietly discounted. He was, in their eyes, becoming expendable. For Hamilton, it wasn't just an insult. It was a betrayal. And more than that, it was a confirmation of everything he had tried to deny since joining the team in red. He had come to Ferrari with dreams of legacy, of completing the arc, of doing what so few had done, lifting the most iconic team in Formula One back to its rightful place. He hadn't just arrived as a driver, he arrived as a believer. And in return, he was slowly but steadily reduced to a supporting role in a story that was never written with him at the center. The executive likely thought the words were harmless, routine, a standard check-in. But they broke something. Something invisible, but unrepairable. Because Hamilton had already been giving everything, not just as a competitor, but as a leader, a mentor, a professional. And now, that final thread of trust had snapped. What began as tension had become rupture. That moment wasn't just awkward. It was the end. Now, the ripple effects are undeniable. The atmosphere around Ferrari is no longer focused, it's fractured. Internally, there is confusion. There is regret. There is fear. And at the center of it all, Charles Leclerc now stands isolated. The balance that once existed, however fragile, has disintegrated. Leclerc, brilliant though he is now forced to carry the emotional and competitive burden of an entire institution. The protection Hamilton once provided, the shielding of pressure, the shared responsibility, the guiding presence, is gone. And with it, Ferrari's internal compass has begun to spin. Fans are reeling. Some have erupted in outrage, condemning Ferrari's failure to hold on to one of the greatest drivers in history. Others are simply stunned into silence, unable to process the abruptness of what just unfolded. The man they had once placed their hope in, the one who represented a new dawn, has walked away not in defeat, but in defiance. Not because he lacked motivation, but because he had grown tired of being treated as a formality rather than a force. The betrayal wasn't just organizational, it was spiritual. And now, the vacuum left in his wake is impossible to ignore. Speculation has spiraled out of control. The paddock is a cauldron of rumors. Could Hamilton call time on his career entirely, ending his journey not with fanfare, but with a quiet, dignified exit? Could he stage the most jaw-dropping return in recent memory, a final chapter with Mercedes, reuniting with a team that once gave him everything? Or in a move no one would have dared suggest even a month ago, could he shock the world by aligning with Red Bull, not as a backup, not as a narrative piece, but as a genuine contender, side by side with Verstappen, on equal ground, in a car built to kill? No scenario feels impossible anymore. Because the one thing that was always true about Lewis Hamilton, that he was driven by purpose, has now evolved into something more dangerous. He is driven by clarity. He sees everything now. The politics, the favoritism, the games, the silence in rooms where decisions were made without him. And he's done playing along. He's done compromising. He's done swallowing his pride to make others comfortable. Ferrari didn't lose Hamilton in one moment. They lost him piece by piece, day by day, decision after decision, until the final cut, that quiet, calculated conversation, severed what little remained. And now, the sport is left staring at a void. Because Hamilton wasn't just a driver. He was a gravitational force. He elevated every team he joined. He drew attention, money, fans, global interest. He was, and still is, a symbol of evolution in a sport terrified of change. But Ferrari tried to reduce him to a statue. Something beautiful, but silent. Something valuable, but controllable. And he refused to play that role. So he walked. And in doing so, he reclaimed his identity. Not as the man in red. Not as the aging champion. But as something else entirely. A free agent of chaos, of legacy, of unmatched skill and unshakable confidence. A man who doesn't need to explain himself anymore. A man who has transcended the politics of teams and entered the rarefied air of myth. Because a man who has already proven everything, who has already won everything, and is still hungry, that man doesn't follow the script. He writes new ones. And now, the world watches and waits, because the scariest thing in sport isn't youth. It isn't talent. It isn't ambition. It's experience, released from constraint. It's Lewis Hamilton, no longer asking to be respected, but prepared to demand it. And whatever comes next, one truth echoes louder than any engine. He didn't quit on Ferrari. He simply refused to be diminished by it. And now, finally, he's free.